I know that title made you stop scrolling. Good. Because what I am about to tell you is going to sound like it has nothing to do with money, and by the end of this video, you are going to understand that it has everything to do with money. Everything. There are 3 foods that the ancient Jewish wisdom tradition identified thousands of years before neuroscience, thousands of years before behavioral economics, thousands of years before any modern researcher thought to study the relationship between what enters the body and what flows through a life. 3 specific foods that the sages connected directly to a person's capacity to receive, hold, and grow wealth. Not as superstition, not as folklore, as a precise, documented, teachable system that was studied in the great academies of learning for centuries, and that I have been applying with the people I guide for over 3 decades. These are not foods you would guess, and the reasons behind them are not what you think. Stay with me. But first, I need you to understand something that most people get completely wrong about the relationship between the physical body and financial life. We live in a culture that has completely separated these 2 things. We treat the body as a machine for productivity, something to be fueled and maintained so that the mind can do the work of making money. And we treat money as an entirely mental and behavioral phenomenon, something governed by decisions, strategies, and market forces. The ancient Jewish wisdom tradition refuses that separation entirely. The sages understood that a human being is a unified system. What you eat shapes how you think. How you think shapes what you believe. What you believe shapes what you receive. And what you receive, or fail to receive, shows up in your bank account, your relationships, your opportunities, and your sense of whether the world is a place of abundance or a place of scarcity. You cannot solve a financial problem by working only on the financial layer. You have to go deeper, and food is one of the deepest layers there is. My name is Rabbi Naomi. I have spent 37 years studying the intersection of Kabbalistic wisdom, Torah law, and the practical dimensions of financial life. I was ordained in a lineage that traces its teaching through the great masters of the Musar tradition and the Hasidic world. Teachers who understood that the refinement of the body and the refinement of the character were not 2 separate projects, but one. My grandmother Rivka, a woman of iron gentleness, if such a thing is possible, taught me the first of these 3 principles when I was 21 years old, sitting with her at her kitchen table in Bnei Brak on a hot July morning, a glass of cold water between us, the fan barely moving the air. She said to me, "Naomi, you want to know why some people have and some people don't? Watch what they eat. Not just what, how, and when, and what they say before they eat, and what they feel while they are eating." I thought she was being poetic. She was being precise. She was 30 years ahead of what the research would eventually confirm. Before I name the 3 foods, I want to tell you about a student of mine named Miriam. She was 38 years old, a talented graphic designer, self-employed, genuinely skilled at her work. She had a good reputation. She had clients who liked her. She had every ingredient for a financially stable life, except that her income was wildly, exhaustingly unpredictable. Feast and famine. A great month followed by 3 terrible ones. She could not find the floor. She could not find the ceiling either, for that matter. She had tried everything she could think of. Different pricing, different platforms, different niches, different marketing approaches. She was not lazy. She was not foolish. But something in the system of her life kept resetting. She came to study with me after a particularly brutal stretch. 4 months in which she had barely covered her rent, despite working constantly. She sat across from me, looking like someone who had been running a race they could not see the end of. And one of the first things I did, which surprised her, which surprises almost everyone, was ask her to describe what she typically ate during her working day. She looked at me like I had changed the subject. I had not changed the subject at all. The first food the tradition warns against, and I want to be careful here about how I frame this, because this is not about dietary moralism, and it is not a guarantee of financial results. It is about what I have observed and what the tradition teaches. The first food is what the sages called ochel the vehilut, food eaten in haste, food consumed without presence, food treated as fuel to be absorbed as quickly as possible so that you can return to what you were doing before you stopped to eat. In the modern world, this looks like eating while working, eating while scrolling, eating standing over the kitchen counter because sitting down feels like losing time, eating in the car, eating without tasting, without pausing, without any awareness that something is actually happening in this moment, something that the tradition regards as an act of enormous spiritual significance. The Talmud teaches that a person's table is like the altar in the temple. The meal is not an interruption. The meal is a ceremony. And when you treat the ceremony as an interruption, you train yourself at the deepest level of the nervous system and the soul to treat receiving as an interruption, to treat abundance as something to get through as quickly as possible, rather than something to inhabit and enjoy and allow to nourish you. I have seen this pattern in more people than I can count express itself as a direct inability to receive financially. Money arrives and immediately becomes something to deal with rather than something to receive with gratitude and intentionality. The relationship with food and the relationship with money are running on the same inner architecture, and when you fix one, the other begins to move. Miriam, when I described this to her, was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I haven't sat down for a meal in months. Months." She was eating over her desk, eating between calls, eating in a way that communicated to every layer of her being that there was never enough time, never enough safety, never enough room to simply stop and receive. The first practice I assigned her was simple. Sit down for every meal. Turn the screen off. Take 3 slow breaths before you begin. Make it a ceremony, even if the ceremony lasts only 10 minutes. She thought this had nothing to do with her income. I told her to give it 6 weeks and then come back to me with data. At the end of 6 weeks, she told me something had shifted in her ability to accept projects that felt too big. I knew then that the inner change had begun. The second food the tradition warns against is more specific and more surprising. The sages, in several places across the Midrashic and Talmudic literature, discuss at length the spiritual effects of food eaten in states of anger, resentment, or unresolved conflict. Not food that causes anger, though that is also addressed. Food eaten while carrying anger. Food consumed when there is a grievance in the chest that has not been spoken, an argument that has not been resolved, a relationship wound that is being carried through the meal like a stone through water. The tradition teaches that this state, this quality of inner turbulence at the moment of eating, literally disorders the receiving mechanism. And this is not mystical hand-waving. This is consistent with what we now understand about the vagal nervous system and its role in digestion and in the body's capacity to process and integrate anything it receives. But the sages went further than the physiology. They said that a person who habitually eats in states of unresolved anger is training their inner world to associate receiving with conflict. And that association becomes, over time, a reflex. Money arrives, conflict arrives with it. An opportunity presents itself. A reason it cannot work appears alongside it. The receiving mechanism and the conflict mechanism become linked, and the only way to break that link is to clean the inner environment before you eat, not to perform positivity, not to pretend the grievance doesn't exist, but to make a practice before meals, before receiving, of putting the conflict down, temporarily, deliberately, not resolving it in that moment necessarily, but refusing to carry it through the act of nourishment. This is the behavior of someone who has decided that their receiving capacity is worth protecting. This was the second practice I gave Miriam. Before each meal, name one thing that you are grateful for, genuinely grateful for, not performatively, and set aside whatever conflict or anxiety or resentment is present. Not forever, just for the duration of the meal. Put it outside the door the way you might put your shoes outside the door. Pick it up again after if you must, but do not bring it to the table. She told me this was harder than she expected, much harder. She had not realized how much of her mental space was occupied by low-grade conflict, small resentments, worries, frustrations that she carried so constantly she had stopped noticing their weight. Naming them and setting them down, even temporarily, was like discovering a muscle she did not know was permanently clenched. By the third week, she said she was sleeping better. By the fifth week, a client she had invoiced 6 months earlier and given up on paid her in full, without explanation. I observed this kind of thing often enough in students doing this work that I have stopped being surprised by it. The clearing of the receiving channel tends to produce effects that show up in unexpected places. The third food, and this is the one that generates the most conversation when I teach it, the one that people argue with, the one that sounds the most counterintuitive, is the food eaten in isolation. Food eaten alone, habitually, without connection, without the dimension of shared table that the tradition regards as one of the most powerful generators of blessing available to a human being. The Hebrew word for bread, lechem, shares its root with the word for war, milchama. The sages noticed this and taught that bread, the staff of life, contains within it both the possibility of nourishment and the possibility of conflict, and that the deciding factor is whether it is broken and shared or consumed alone and in competition with the world. Eating together, genuinely together, with presence and conversation, and the acknowledgement that you are in relationship with other human beings who also need to be nourished, is described in the tradition as an act that opens channels of blessing both above and below. The mystical literature is very specific about this. A table where people eat together in genuine connection is described as a place where the Shekhinah, the divine presence, rests. And where the divine presence rests, abundance follows. Not as superstition, as a description of what happens in a human life when it is genuinely embedded in community, in relationship, in the acknowledgement that you are not building your prosperity alone and were never meant to. The practical dimension of this is something I have observed repeatedly. People who eat alone consistently, not occasionally, not sometimes, but as a settled pattern of life, tend to carry a corresponding isolation in their financial lives. They do not ask for help. They do not collaborate. They do not build the webs of relationship that are, in virtually every field of human endeavor, the primary vehicle through which opportunity travels. They mistake isolation for independence. This is a mistake. Genuine independence is built on a foundation of genuine interdependence, and the table is where you practice it, where you remember, meal by meal, that you are a relational being in a relational world, and that your prosperity is embedded in that web rather than separate from it. For Miriam, the third practice was the hardest of all. She was an introvert. She lived alone. Sharing meals was not a natural part of her week. I did not ask her to transform her entire social architecture. I asked her to eat with another person twice a week. That was it. 2 meals. Whatever those meals looked like, a friend, a family member, a colleague, a neighbor. 2 shared meals per week, eaten with presence and genuine attention to the other person at the table. At the end of the second month of doing all 3 practices together, her income in that month was the highest of any single month in 3 years of self-employment. I am not telling you that to make a promise. I am telling you because I have observed this kind of shift in various forms and across varying time frames in people who commit to all 3 practices together, not one alone, not 2, all 3, because they work as a system. They address the receiving mechanism from 3 different angles simultaneously, and the combined effect is something the tradition would call opening the channel of blessing. And what tends to flow through an open channel is abundance. Now I need to warn you about something, because I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't. When you begin these 3 practices, you will encounter resistance. Not from the outside, from the inside. The practice of sitting down to eat will feel like losing time. The practice of setting conflict aside will feel like pretending. The practice of shared meals will feel like effort you cannot afford. Every one of those feelings is the old pattern defending itself. Every one of those feelings is, in fact, a signal that the practice is reaching the right place. The resistance is the block announcing that it has been found. Do not mistake the resistance for a reason to stop. Understand it as confirmation that you have begun. The complete system that underpins these 3 practices, the full dietary and spiritual framework from the tradition, including the prayers before and after meals, the specific contemplative practices for each of the 3 areas, the additional teachings on what the tradition calls the elevation of eating, and the broader prosperity code work that connects the physical body to the financial life. All of that is contained in the program I have built called the Prosperity Letters. The link is waiting for you in the description below this video. I built this program for the people who understand, on some level, they may not be able to fully articulate, that the standard advice is not reaching the actual problem. The actual problem is deeper than strategy, and the actual solution is older than any financial system currently in operation. If something in this video landed for you today, if you recognized yourself in any of these 3 patterns, I want you to leave a comment below. Tell me which of the 3 foods resonated most. Was it the eating in haste, the eating in anger, or the eating in isolation? Your answer will tell me where your work begins. And I respond to as many comments as I can, because this is not a broadcast, it is a conversation. And your voice in the comments also extends this teaching to people who are sitting right now with the exact same exhaustion Miriam carried into my study. People who have tried everything on the surface and have never been told to look underneath. If this channel is new to you, I invite you with complete sincerity to subscribe. What I offer here is not clickbait dressed as wisdom. It is the actual tradition, brought forward with care and precision, week after week, for people who are ready to go deeper than the usual conversation about money. Subscribe and let the teaching come to you steadily. Steadiness is not incidental to this work. It is the work itself. And if this video gave you something real, if you are going to eat your next meal differently because of what you heard here today, please press the like, not as a transaction, as an act of the very principle I just taught you. Circulation. What you release with genuine appreciation returns to you. A like is small. The intention behind it is not small at all. May your table become an altar this week. May every meal you eat become a practice of receiving, fully, presently, without rushing, without conflict, without isolation. May the channel that has been narrowed by habit and haste and the carrying of old wounds begin now to open, wide enough for what belongs to you to finally find its way in. You were not built for scarcity. The tradition has known that since before your grandmother's grandmother was born. It is time for your daily life to know it too. I want to say one more thing before you go, because I have been teaching this long enough to know what happens in the hours after a video like this one ends. You close the screen, you return to your day, and the voice of practicality arrives and begins to negotiate. It says, "That was interesting, but." It says, "Maybe for some people, but." It says, "My situation is different, but." I am familiar with that voice. I have heard it from every student I have ever had at some point in the early stages of the work. And I want to offer you this as a closing thought, not as a rebuttal, but as a genuine invitation to consider. That voice is not wrong to be cautious. Caution is intelligent. But notice what caution is protecting in this case. It is not protecting you from risk. These practices carry no risk. They cost nothing. They require only attention and intention and a willingness to bring more consciousness to something you are already doing every day of your life. What caution is protecting in this specific situation is the familiarity of the problem, the known shape of the struggle. And there is a kind of comfort in a familiar struggle that can masquerade as wisdom. It is not wisdom. It is the preference for a known pain over an unknown possibility. And the tradition has a word for the moment when you choose the unknown possibility anyway. The tradition calls that word courage, and it calls what follows blessing. You have both available to you right now. You have always had both. The question is simply whether today is the day you choose to use them. Go gently. Go with hunger, the real kind, the kind that is not about food at all, the kind that has been sitting quietly underneath everything you have been building and striving and hoping for. That hunger is not a flaw. That hunger is the thing that brought you here today. Honor it. Feed it something real. The tradition has been waiting with extraordinary patience to do exactly that.